Hello, good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to this special Jamlab Meetup in partnership with the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism to discuss key findings from this year's digital news report. The focus for today will be on findings for Africa, mainly looking at Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. My name is Tshabalala, and I head up the Jamlab program here at the Wits Center for Journalism. And joining me today is Nick Newman, who is the DNR's lead author and senior research associate at the Reuters Institute, Chris Roper, deputy CEO of Code for Africa, Adeyemo, senior program manager for Code for Africa, Khadija Patel, chairperson for the International Press Institute, Motunrayo Alaka, executive director for the Wallace Sonika Center for Investigative Journalism, as well as Allan, Olingo news editor for the East African. So before we get into today's discussion, I just want to do a bit of housekeeping. So if you can, please do share and tweet today's session or the conversation rather on social media using the hashtag Jamlab Meetup as well as DNR22. Really want this to be a discussion and would like for you to please use the Q&A function for any questions directed to the speakers. And then for all comments and queries, please leave those in the chat function. Just so you are aware, this session is being recorded and will be publicly available on Jamlab's and the Reuters Institute digital platforms. So today's conversation will focus on the digital news report released a few days ago by the Reuters Institute. Our conversation will focus on the African continent and delve into what the findings from the report mean for the news market in our region. Nick, can you begin by giving us a snapshot of the findings for this year? And then Chris and Tolu will jump in right after you share the findings for South Africa and Nigeria, and perhaps maybe speak to Kenya's results as well.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, and really good to have the opportunity to talk about the African results. Just a bit of background first of all. Our digital news report, for people who are not familiar with it, covers 46 markets in total, representing half the world's population and 6 continents. Obviously, we're going to focus today on the 3 countries that we cover in Africa. Just a reminder of the methodology. So the data I'm going to share is based on online polling. So as representative of samples we can find in each country, it will tend to underrepresent traditional news behaviors such as television and print and radio when we talk about cross-platform behavior, particularly in some of the African countries where the internet penetration is a bit lower. And these are the 3 countries that we cover in Africa. And I should also note that the samples in these 3 countries tend to represent younger, better educated and largely English speaking people. So we need to bear that in mind when considering the results. The survey was conducted on our behalf by YouGov in January, February this year. So just before the war in Ukraine started, actually, though we did do some subsequent polling afterwards to check that the results still stood. And I should say that the report is completely independent. It's supported by 15 different organizations, including Google, BBC, media regulators, academic institutions around the world. So one of the advantages of doing polling like this every year is we can build up a picture over time of the sort of structural changes that are going on in media consumption of different sources of news. And before I get into the African data, just as a reference point, I'm going to show you what has happened over the last 10 years in the United States. This is a country we know pretty well, and we've been polling since 2013. And you can see the orange line there. You can see how far and fast television news has fallen, 72% to 48% in the last decade. You can see how far print has fallen, 47% to 15%. Radio is down as well. This is primarily younger people turning away from traditional sources. Social media, the rise in the blue, with the election of Donald Trump peaking and then sort of flattening off. And online, interestingly, is just flat, so it's not really grown. And it's hard to sort of explain that unless you look at another line, which is the percentage of people who say they've consumed none of these sources in the last week. And you can see that group of sort of disconnected news users rising from 3% to 15% in the United States. So that's just kind of a reference point. So fall in traditional media, which we see across our data point. Now, we've only been polling in Africa for a few years. But we can start to see some of the similar trends in South Africa, where we've been doing this since 2019. So we can see some decline in traditional sources, so print 40% down to 33% in a few years, radio down a bit as well. Television's interesting. You see that little sort of bump with COVID. So people really turned on the television during COVID and broadcast media, but slightly down over the period. And again, online is flat. But interestingly, when we ask people, like, have you consumed none of these sources, only 1%. So we're not seeing the same level of disconnection in Africa as we are in some Western countries like the US and the UK. On the other hand, we have in the report this year identified another group of people which we identify as selective news avoiders. So these are people who do consume news, but they also avoid some news some of the time. So across our entire sample, 38% say they often or sometimes avoid the news, and that's up by 10 percentage points since 2019. You can see how dramatically that's increased. That avoidance has increased in countries like Brazil and the UK. And we see this in Africa too. So in South Africa, Kenya and Nigeria, it's sort of either on or above the average of all the countries, people saying they're selectively avoiding some news. Why are they doing this? So the top reasons are pretty similar across countries. So they include people just say there's too much news about politics, there's too much news about COVID-19, these sort of very big, often divisive, depressing subjects. More than a third talk about news having a negative effect on their mood, on their mental health. I think this is a really sort of a wake-up call to what, that journalism, the way we cover stories, may be affecting people's mental health. I think is something really to think about. Other people say they don't trust the news, or they're avoiding the news because they think it's untrustworthy or biased, or it leads to arguments as well. And we can just bring a bit of that to life with some quotes from some qualitative interviews we did with younger people this year. Here's somebody who talks about, that politics doesn't feel relevant to them, makes me feel small. What I say doesn't make a difference. So that sense of powerlessness that I think a lot of people feel when it comes to big news stories. This is one about, effects on mental health. So somebody, worried about exposing themselves to news because of how it might affect their mood. So these are trends that we see across markets, but there are also some particular characteristics of the 3 African markets that we look at. And the most obvious is the heavily mobile nature of the market, which but it's interesting to see this reflection in the data. So around 80% use smartphone for news every week, which is much higher than other markets. So it's about sort of 50-60% in many European markets, for example. And, I think this has obviously big implications for the type of content that works on small screens, how you need to format the news, for example, as well as for the business models that are going to work in a mobile environment. They're very different from a desktop, and of course, very different from print. I think one other really interesting difference which we explored this year is the popularity or the interest in certain types of news content. So this is a question we ask about how interested you are in particular types of news. And I'm showing this by region. So we've averaged the 3 African countries together. And across the board, you see broadly interest in news is higher than for any other region or for most other regions, particularly politics. So very high interest in politics. Also business and entertainment, really interesting. So 55% say across those 3 African countries, they're interested in business news compared with just a third in European countries. Very high interest in celebrity and entertainment news across Africa as well, and across these African countries. So a kind of interesting mix of sort of hard news on the one hand, but also some lighter subjects as well. And that's probably driven by high use of social media, which I'll come on to in a moment. If we turn now to trust, and last year what we saw was a sort of, if you like, a COVID bounce, is people were really, we saw trust figures going up, partly because people were really looking for reliable news and trusted news brands. This year, we started to see falls in many markets. So over half our markets, or around half our markets, trust is significantly down. It's only up in 7. This is the full list of trust scores, and we ask people to what extent do you trust most news most of the time, and you can see that varies from Finland at the top, 59%, 69%, so they trust most news most of the time, to only 26% in the United States, so the lowest in our survey. And a lot of that is driven by, deep divisions, polarization over politics, over issues of social justice, and these debates raging in the media. Maybe Chris and Tolu will reflect on this in a minute in terms of one of the reasons why trust in Africa generally is much higher. It may be partly there's more respect for traditional media and for journalists. We certainly don't have much of that in the UK or the US. Of course, one of the elements that has the potential to undermine trust in news is the growth of misinformation and disinformation, often spread in social networks. It's a huge issue in all over the world, but particularly in African countries. So in our survey, over 70% say they struggle to tell the difference between what is true and fake online when it comes to news on the internet, and that is much higher than any other region. So the average for all of the survey is 54%, so that's higher. And we get an insight into what's going on when we ask people what kind of misinformation do people think they're seeing. It's a difficult question to ask in surveys. At the top there you have, across all regions, you have politics and COVID. I think Kenya is one of the few that says there's more political misinformation than there is health misinformation. For most other countries, it's the other way around. But in Africa, you also see a lot of misinformation about celebrities. You see a lot of scams relative to other parts of the world. And maybe in the panel we can pick up on why this seems to be worse in Africa and what could be done about it. Every year we ask respondents how they access news online. Where do you start your journey? And this is, first of all, using data from all countries about main gateways. And we can see that the majority of people now say that they prefer to access the news, to start their news journey with social media or with search, or perhaps with aggregators. And every year, fewer people are accessing directly by going to a news brand or a news app or website. We've looked at this over time, and this next chart really plots some of those preferences over time. Again, this is the average across all data. And you can see that people who prefer to go directly was a third, and that's down to less than a quarter now, so 32% to 23%. And you can see, if you plot that against social media in the blue, more people increasingly say that they prefer to start with social media. An important caveat is it is different in different countries. So there are some countries in our survey where there's a sort of still this high trust and deep connection with brands. So some of the Nordic countries, even the UK, but then a lot of the African countries, very heavy dependence on social media as a gateway. So most people in Kenya, for example, over 51% of our samples say they prefer to start their journey through social media. That obviously makes it much harder to sort of build those direct connections over time. So when we talk about social networks and the news in these three countries, what are we talking about? So this chart looks at the top social networks for any purpose and for news. And across all three countries, we see Facebook and WhatsApp at the top. But interestingly, in most of them, losing ground compared with last year. And actually over the last few years, we've seen Facebook becoming less important for news and WhatsApp starting to become a little bit less important for news. Part of the reason for that is actually YouTube's becoming more important. So visual networks, as video becomes more important, and also Instagram. And look in South Africa, you can see the emergence of TikTok for the first time in our data for any purpose and also for news. I should also just point out Telegram has gained a lot in the last few years, and people often switching out of WhatsApp into Telegram as a messaging application, and being used for disinformation, of course, as well. Across our entire survey, we find that TikTok is now the fastest growing network for news, and you see sort of big brands like the BBC coming onto TikTok. You see influencers alongside influencers and ordinary people. 40% of 18 to 24s are using TikTok for any purpose, and 15% on average for news. Interestingly, a lot of the fastest growth has been in countries in the global south. So Kenya, for example, very, very fast growth and high use. South Africa, I've mentioned already. Partly that's because TikTok is bundling free minutes in some parts of the world to encourage use in the same way as WhatsApp did as well. Why are people using TikTok? Well, people find the presentation really appealing, the algorithm, they talk about being incredibly addictive. People worry about trustworthy news in this kind of environment, as we've seen with other networks. So this is obviously going to be increasingly an issue. For TikTok, you'll be pleased to hear not everyone thinks the future of news is TikTok. These short videos, so here's somebody talking about, you know, the lack of professionalism, and they prefer their news to be presented with more context and more time. Just finally, from me, I think it's really interesting to think about, you know, formats and formats of news and how they are changing. And we find, we ask people, you know, do you prefer to read the news or do you prefer to watch the news? And we find really interesting differences across countries. So in Northern Europe, we tend to find a strong preference for reading because it gives people more control, it's quicker. But in other parts of the world, it's a very different story. In the Philippines, for example, over half say that they either prefer video or have equal preference for reading and watching news. You know, in Africa, we see a difference between Kenya, where a significant proportion of people say they mainly prefer to watch the news online, and Nigeria, where a relatively small proportion do. I think probably data charges have quite a lot to do with some of these differences and the relatively cheaper cost of data in some countries than others, and that has an implication for consumption. So I mean, just look at Kenya again. 52% say they have accessed news via YouTube in the last week, compared with just 9% in the UK. So in the UK, people aren't using these video, that they're not so inclined to use video in the first place, but they're not using YouTube to the same extent for news. So that's just kind of a headlines from me on some of the sort of top findings. Let's just dive quickly into some of the country views of this. I'm going to ask Chris Roper first, just to tell us a little bit more about the market in South Africa and some of the things that he's seeing.
Thanks, Nick, and hello, everybody. So I don't want to take too much time out from what I'm sure is going to be a very interesting panel discussion. So, and for me, the most important takeaway from this report is the stuff that Nick has just referenced around trust, and why is such a big difference between trust in the three countries that Reuters looks at versus the average and other parts of the world. So, yeah, so ignoring the previous slide, which just shows us that television and the big behemoths in digital space are still kind of attracting a lot of attention. The question for me is, how do we keep that attention a productive and profitable one, and one that's kind of advancing the democratic cause rather than advancing the commercial cause of those news organizations, if I may put it that way. So for me, the really interesting thing is that South Africa and Tolu will talk to Nigeria, but all three countries have a very high overall trust score in the news. Now, Nick has asked the question, which is a question I think that news organizations need to ask themselves and need to spend quite a lot of time thinking about, is why do we have this high level of trust? You know, and I think the answers are going to be different for each country, in the same way that Nick kind of pointed to the kind of infrastructural differences that can alter something like which countries prefer video versus others. I think we're going to find there's some infrastructural and some political reasons. But I also think there must be a commonality that runs through the three countries. And, you know, I would go so far as to say fairly foolhardily that there might be a commonality that runs through many African countries that we aren't even looking at yet. And that's something I really think we should spend a lot of time thinking about. But in South Africa, our big trusted brands are News24. So it's a digital first platform, ENCA television, BBC, SABC. So there's quite a
platform agnostic sort of a kind of a trust level, you know. But what does slightly perturb me is that what we know to be not trustworthy brands also have a fairly high level of trust. And I think it would do people well, it would serve them well if they read the whole digital news report and looked at the section on polarization and how polarization affects trust, and how polarization in news markets kind of forces brands to take different and rather more kind of narrow sort of brands, make more narrow brand statements, you know. We don't want to become a market like the US where we thrive on that kind of polarization and discord. So yeah, for me, that is the important thing, that we look at these trust scores and we try to work out, why is this happening? Why do people in Africa, the 3 African countries, we look at trust the news so much more than much of the rest of the world? You know, one of the reasons could be related to the misinformation number, which is that we need trusted media because we have so much more awareness of how much misinformation we have. And also the costs of disinformation and misinformation are very real to lives and to livelihoods in the countries that we're looking at here. But not to beat around the bush too much, or rather not to beat that drum too much, I'm going to hand over to Tolu.
Thanks, Chris. All right, hi everyone. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly talk about some of the insights for Nigeria. So in this year's report, we continue to see that Nigerians are increasingly accessing news online. 95% of Nigerian respondents sourced news online, 79% from social media, 61% from television, and 3% from print. For print this year, we saw a 5 percentage point increase this year. So in terms of top news sources accessed, big local brands like The Punch, Channels TV, The Vanguard continue to lead the offline list. Then international brands like BBC News and CNN are popular online with our respondents. Punch Online, Post NG, Vanguard Online, Sarah Reporters are also seeing more traffic, with more respondents using this local media platform as sources of news more than 3 days per week. We also noticed that media organizations are starting to explore opportunities to reach wider audiences, and they are starting to adopt innovative solutions to revenue challenges that the media sector is facing. Specifically, some Nigerian print media such as Daily Trust, Premium Times, exploring digital subscription as a way to make their organizations more sustainable and independent. In addition, we also saw an increase in the number of digital media startups in Nigeria. Some of these startups are being owned or managed by freelance or former employees of traditional media organizations, as they sort of take advantage of the emerging consumption of digital content to become media entrepreneurs. Yeah, so let's quickly look at the trust scores for Nigerian brands. For Nigeria, overall trust in news increased 58% this year. That's up 4 points on last year. We also noticed that rising trust levels for top brands like Channels TV, Vanguard, The Punch have been leading the list for the past 2 years. We also saw that scores for Arise TV increased this year by 6% higher up. Interestingly, a minority of the respondents at 38% and 43% felt that legacy media lacked undue political influence and business influence respectively. But we've come to see that traditional media continue to remain the most trusted media, as the respondents have this, they choose this medium to access credible news. So as the internet and social media continue to act as central players in disseminating news, one emerging concern is the joining online spread of misinformation. So in the context of Nigeria, misinformation is a ticking time bomb. And then considering that the country is a sensitive and diverse society which is characterized by different ethnic and religious groups. So misinformation could escalate the existing tensions and consequently disrupt the country's pace and development. So due to the consequence of misinformation, like causing divisions, the Nigerian government has been taking action with several interventions since 2015. The government is moving towards regulating social media and other online platforms. So last year, Nigerian government also pushed to regulate social media through National Broadcasting Commission Act Amendment Bill. This act received wide-scale backlash because of its potential to violate citizens' rights and infringe on media freedom. Additionally, the government is also opting for administrative means to regulate the sector, like the recently released Code of Practice for Internet intermediaries. The Code of Practice was released about 2 weeks ago. So, but then we noticed that this framework has also received backlash from stakeholders who are then opposing the code. So although the code is still in its draft stage, so there's a possibility that most of the stipulations in the code would be revised before it gets enacted. I think this is something that we are going to continue to monitor and maybe to sort of highlight in next year's report.
Thanks so much, Tolu. So I'm just going to very briefly to finish talk about the Kenyan market. What's I think interesting about this is you've got sort of the big commercial media groups such as the Standard Group and Nation Group dominating consumption in Kenya. They're doing that both online and offline. And that means there's less room for some of the international media that you saw in Nigeria, for example, and in South Africa. So the BBC and CNN plays a smaller role here. Excuse me. It's also interesting how the public service broadcaster KBC is not really able to build a significant audience online, unlike SABC in South Africa. If we look at trust, trust is down a bit. Elections are coming up in Kenya. That may be part of the reason for that. Most of the trusted brands tend to be those that built a reputation in broadcast TV or radio, and then popular newspapers like the Star and the Nairobian have a lower level of trust. And I think we heard from Tolu in Nigeria, one of the most interesting developments is a lot of online startups. There's also a lot of the traditional media companies now that are starting to try to charge for premium content online. And of course, trust is going to be critical if you want to persuade people to pay for online news. So those are some of the trust scores in Kenya. So hopefully that was a good sort of data refresh of what's going on and setting up the discussion that we're going to have now. If you're interested in any of the data, it's available for free online via our website. Thanks, I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Nick. Before I bring in Khadija, Allan, and Motunrayo, I've got sort of two questions, one for Chris and one for Tolu. Chris, I'm interested to find out, perhaps you might not have the answer, but Daily Sun is one of the top read brands in South Africa, but has a high percentage of consumers who read it, but also a high percentage of people who don't trust the news or trust its news. Why is that?
So are you saying it is a high percentage of people who don't trust its news?
Yeah, so I think it's 25% who don't trust the news, but it's one of the top read brands in South Africa.
I think it's going to depend on what kind of Daily Sun reader you are. So there's a lot of hugely important, hugely truthful, and hugely useful stuff in Daily Sun. There's also, as we know, a lot of clickbait nonsense about, a goat ate my car kind of stuff. I think it's just going to depend on what. On which of those readers you are, on which of those stories you think. I think it's quite a bipolar brand, the Daily Sun. So I think it is. I think we should focus on the trusted bit of it rather than the not trusted. I think it's quite highly trusted, considering it's actually a tabloid brand, and I think that's positive for us. I mean, I think that it means that you can use something like a tabloid platform to actually do good and to produce useful news, not just pabulum.
Thanks, Chris. Tolu, and perhaps Motunrayo, you could come in here after Tolu. BBC Online introduced Pidgin English on their platform. Would that attributed to it being the trusted brand on the survey, or would there be other sort of reasons for that?
Okay, so that's a really interesting question. So I think the fact that BBC had to sort of localize the content to reach grassroots, I think it's a very innovative way, right? I think that might be something that would probably increase the trust in BBC. Maybe something to look out for next year in terms of the next survey. Yeah.
Thanks, Tolu. Motunrayo, would you want to sort of contribute to that in how BBC Online is one of the trusted brands or the top trusted brand in Nigeria in comparison to sort of local brands?
Okay, well, BBC has been present in Nigeria for many, many years, as old as many of the other organizations that were surveyed here, or older than many of them actually. Yes, the concentration on the Pidgin line started lately, but they've been available, especially in northern Nigeria, you know, as radio. They have been available and they have been broadcasting. And sometimes these are places where, you know, some of the other media houses do not reach. And so that capacity to reach is also something. But something that I also see BBC doing that may have given them an edge is the high publicity they put to story publications. So when they do investigations, there's a whole lot of strategy and events, you know, media campaign that goes along with it, which also draws attention to the platform.
And to ask a follow-up on to that, Motunrayo, are African brands doing the same? Are we putting enough effort in popularizing or I guess, yeah, punting our work to audiences?
Okay, so I'll use that opportunity to answer that and to just make general comment on what I saw in the survey, starting from, you know, audience interest. One of the things that we have seen in doing surveys here within the country on how the media reports particular subjects is the fact that there seems to be a gap between what the media is doing and what the audience wants. And that definitely also contributes to issues of people complaining about repetitiveness, you know, the fact that we're bringing down moats because most of the legacy medias and much of what is in news can really be categorized as more of bad news. And news is more than just bad news. There's so much more happening. But also when we're dealing with so many issues of development, issues of corruption, issues of social injustice, you know, the media tends to want to definitely be on the side of social justice and point out these ills in society so that there can be change. But there's also a need to go back to those very basic, you know, purposes of media to inform, to educate, you know, so that, you know, the media becomes more linked to the audience. And the distance between media and its audience, you know, you can speak to that also when you're talking about the growth of populism across the world. The fact that, you know, sometimes media can be so technical and elitist that, you know, we lose out on a group. And that is why language like Pidgin that is spoken by almost every Nigerian, you know, would penetrate, and platforms that would use Pidgin would penetrate. The issue of trust of the audience is also something. I was reading the research and I thought, wow, how the trust, is it the fact that in Africa we have not yet digitized and opened up the media space as much as the West? Is that why the trust is still there, so that the guards of the profession and its ethics are still, you know, much on their guard doing the work of, you know, protecting and reporting properly? But another challenge with trust and misinformation is actually the opening up, which is great. You know, so many online media houses, so many people now able to, you know, start their own platforms and do things. But the challenge that I see is that, you know, when media professionals publish, there's an ethics, there's a commitment to do no harm. We are committed to the professionalism and the ethics. But now, you know, everybody can share, everybody can publish, but not everybody is responsible for what they publish, which takes us to the place of the need to have some regulations in terms of, yes, everybody can publish. Now, when you ask who is a journalist, you can just tweet that and you'll be surprised how much of response, different kind of names, influencers, you see influencers, you see bloggers, and the more that it is difficult when the challenges come, we all, have to share the challenges of misinformation and lack of trust that comes from having so many platforms and not knowing which one to pick. So let me stop from there now so that other people can contribute.
Thanks, Motunrayo. Allan, I want to bring you in. What has been the Kenyan experience or the East African experience in terms of trusted brands in Kenya?
Thanks, Tshepo. I hope I'm audible enough.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, thank you. Now, for the Kenyan market, it's a little bit different. From the Reuters report, I can clearly see there's a 4% drop in terms of trust. And I think this is mostly because we are into an election year. I think we have, as of today, less than 40 days into the general election. But the media still evokes that trust in public, even though we've seen a slight reduction in that. And more so, especially because of, as the report correctly puts it, there's a lot of state capture, quote unquote, with the latest, the current administration having muzzled the press through advertising. A lot of the public clearly see most of the headlines and all that as pro-government, and little about the opposition. So yes, that definitely has contributed in that drop of trust within the media. But for publications that really don't cover the hard politics, the likes of the East African Business Daily and all that, I think their trust levels are high, and especially because they are deemed as authoritative in the fields they try to cover. So anything that literally handles politics will definitely have trust issues, especially with the public. Back to you, Tshepo.
Thanks, Allan. Colleagues, I want to encourage you to please do send through your questions using the Q&A function, and we'll get to those. Those who are listening via live stream, do use the DNR 2022, or rather DNR22 hashtag, and we will try to get to those if my colleagues could help me with that. Khadija, I want to bring you in. Motunrayo touched a bit on misinformation, and in your line of work, you've worked with South African newsrooms, but also work with a lot of other newsrooms on the continent and elsewhere in the world. And according to the report, it seems like misinformation seems to be worse in Africa. Why do you think this is the case, and what can we do about it as newsrooms?
So yeah, it's interesting. I think that depending on who you ask, it's either worse or terribly worse. I don't think newsrooms actually have a solution yet. I think that a lot of our response, our gut response to misinformation and disinformation so far has been to launch fact-checking initiatives. And while I think there continues to be a space for those kinds of initiatives, I'm not sure they are the comprehensive approach we need to combat misinformation and disinformation. So I'm left a little puzzled, as I think many people are around the world, about how best to combat this, and what is the particular role journalists and editors can play in crafting a response. Because even the real problem that we have, Tshepo, is even if somehow we are able to prevail on the social media networks to somehow root out all of the bad stuff or the bad information, in the happiest of circumstances, if everything goes according to plan and people are prevailed upon not to prioritize profit over the prosperity of humanity, and somehow the algorithms are cleaned up and there's only good stuff that can be shared, and somehow we get that balance right, the truth is that we are struggling as well as newsrooms to actually get to all the stories we need to get to, simply because our resources have declined so much. Our ability to actually get to all the stories we need to has shrunk. So I think that even our ability to fill the vacuum, if that vacuum does arrive, is constrained. So I think that that's something that we have to consider as well. How best do we equip newsrooms to do, or to spread better information? That is a key part of the problem, I think. But on top of that, I think that we have to remember that Africa is a young population. There are a lot of young people in Africa, and that's how Africa is perhaps a lot more different to some of the other regions surveyed in the DNR. I think that one of the key findings from the DNR this year is actually about the changing consumption habits of particularly young people, their relation to news brands, how they are accessing news. And I have a sister who's 21 years old, and I don't think she's ever accessed a news portal formally ever. And I remember a few years ago asking her, how do you know what's happening in the world? And she said, well, that's, at that point, TikTok hadn't really covered this. She was still in school at that time. She said, well, there's Snapchat. Snapchat tells me what's going on in the world. It's a scary prospect. And now, I watch her, and she's a graduate, a young graduate. And so she's earning, so she has some disposable income, but she's certainly not inclined to pay for news. She instead, is happy with finding out what's happening in the world through her social networks. So I think that we have a bigger role to play as journalists, but as also like the greater media ecosystem in trying to understand how we shift our approaches to reach young people, to help them better understand the value of journalism, but also I think that, I think Nick mentioned, changing forms as well. And I think that this is something for us to be less precious about, I think, as well. That just because it's not an 800-word story, a text story, it can still be journalism if it does indeed fulfill other criteria. So I think that, but all of this needs time, and it needs space really for innovation, for experimentation. And my worry is that a lot of newsrooms simply don't have this. Everyone is under extreme pressure. We were already under pressure before the pandemic. The pandemic worsened things. Though there's been an improvement, I think, in everybody's fortunes over the last year, certainly we're not at 2020 levels. Things are precarious for many, many news organizations. I know in South Africa, we lost many journalists. Many journalists simply lost their jobs. Many community news brands simply shut down, were not able to withstand the pandemic. And that really has a cost for how we build our understanding of what's happening. So I sound a little pessimistic, I think, but it's because I am worried, I think. I am always encouraged. I think that there's always an opportunity for us. But I think that what I hope is that we can use things like the DNR, these moments in time, to actually push through some urgency. We can't let much more time go by without actually putting our heads together and working towards finding solutions.
Thanks, Khadija. I want to move on to other sort of parts of the report, but before I do that, Nick, I've got a question from you from Rabio, who says there seems to be the emerging issue of misinformation and its weaponization across the surveyed countries. However, did the research explore the impact of existing fact-checking organizations in these countries, and what does the future look like for players in these niche spaces?
Yeah, I think Khadija's, we didn't directly address it this year, but we have talked, we've done previous research on this and done qualitative research as well. And I think Khadija's, addressed this already to some extent, is that fact-checking works really well with people who already trust the news. It kind of helps to build trust with people who already, have a relationship with brands. I think the problem that we're seeing is people who increasingly don't have relationships with those brands, or who profoundly distrust what you do already. And fact-checking isn't going to help that. And there is some research that's been done which even suggests there's a backfire effect. The more you do it, the more entrenched they become in their positions. So, I agree with Khadija. I think the solution is extremely difficult. You probably need a strategy which is about building up trust on the one hand through things like fact-checking, greater transparency, more resources, dealing with some of the financial problems that allow journalists to get out there and do better reporting. But at the same time, you almost need a PR campaign and a literacy campaign to persuade people who either are not yet interested in the news why they should be, but also that starts to address those issues of polarization in society. But that can't just be for journalists. I mean, that's a much wider societal problem.
Thanks, Nick. There's other practical questions I want you to tackle quickly. Question from Laid Zaglami: why is Algeria and North Africa not mentioned in the report?
Yeah, so we have a commitment to try and make the report more global, and that's one of the reasons we've introduced polling recently in South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria. The difficulty is doing online polls to a high enough standard in terms of representative panels, where we can be sure that the data is consistent over time, but also that it is representative. And to some extent we achieve that, but we also have to put caveats in. So I think over time it's just going to get much easier to do polling across a range of African and Middle Eastern countries where we don't have any representation so far. But our aim is definitely to do that over time.
One last for you, Nick. There's a popular news site in Kenya called tuko.co.ke
Sure.
that curiously does not appear on the list of the top digital news platforms in Kenya. Why is that?
Right, so we work very closely with experts like Chris and Tolu to select the news brands, and we don't always get right. We listen and we will adjust accordingly. So if there's good evidence that this brand is getting high usage, then we will include it next year, of course.
Awesome, thank you so much, Nick. Khadija touched a bit on Africa's young population, and I was keen, maybe Nick, you could start off by answering this question, and then I'll get into the main question that I want to ask the panelists, is that what is the sort of age bracket that you use or of the surveyed population for Africa? Do you have the number, or is
yeah? So in across the, I mean, we try and make it as representative as we can of all populations. Obviously, Africa has a younger population. The tricky thing is that people over the age of 50, 55 in Africa tend not to, and there are quite a lot of them, tend not to be on online panels. So effectively, we put a cap on it at 55 in countries like Nigeria, for example, which means that we can't claim to be nationally representative. We're basically looking at a younger age, and that's one of the constraints. That's one of the reasons that we struggle. But obviously, we have loads of younger people in the population of the sample, so we've got a good picture of them.
Perfect. Thanks, Nick. Khadija, Motunrayo, Allan, and perhaps Tolu, if you could also come in here. We saw in the report that Instagram and TikTok are slowly becoming prominent platforms where young people access the news. In Kenya and South Africa, TikTok is one of those rising platforms where young people use the platforms to access news. What are newsrooms doing in your respective sort of countries or respective spaces that you've seen? What are newsrooms doing to, at least in Africa, to attract young people to access news? Allan? I don't know if you've lost Allan. Allan?
No, I'm here. I'm here, Tshepo. Thanks. For Kenya, it's actually true, because the rise in digital journalism, one is a big contributor. We are seeing a lot of young people trying to push their stories, telling their own stories, and using all these platforms, YouTube, Instagram, and lately TikTok. Secondly, I think for us is just that mobile phone access and also the affordability in terms of data. A lot of that becomes a big contributor for them. Then also for newsrooms, most of the time we are noticing a lot of traffic when we look at our traffic sources. A lot of the traffic is now being pushed from socials as opposed to organic or search engine. And by socials here, we're also looking at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So clearly, again, when you look at the demographics, when you try to break this down, look at demographics, you notice it's under 24s who are mostly coming through from these social sites. So yes, this is becoming a big deal. And it's just basically a generation that wants to tell their own story and consume their own stories. So literally, the newsrooms are sort of conforming to change to try and adapt to the needs of this emerging market and serve them on the kind of news that they are seeking. And it's not the traditional way anymore. Tshepo.
Thanks, Allan. Motunrayo, how are newsrooms in Nigeria strategizing around using Instagram and TikTok to reach young audiences?
Okay, so generally that's not a survey that I have done deeply, but I'll speak generally to how news media platforms have tried to use social media to spread news. So I know that many of the newspapers, of course, starting from the basic, having e-copies of what they publish available, and there's a lot of sharing on platforms. And the challenge of that, of course, is that it further dwindles revenue cost for buying the hard copies, because now people can access a paper that is sold hard copy on their phones for free from various sources, depending on the links that you have. I know that a number of media houses are also doing news summaries, so 2-liners, 3-liners with links to the major news, trying to share so that people can have it on their phones. Many media houses are also taking advantage of Twitter Spaces, Premium Times, the cable, using Twitter Spaces more to raise conversations that are in the news online, on Twitter, for instance, to actually generate some discussion, especially with younger people. So I see clearly that there is a challenge that we need to take in terms of creativity, not necessarily innovation, but creativity in terms of looking at how do you meet the standard of news. Already a space like Twitter already limits you in terms of, you're trying to tell a story that you told in 1,000 words, you're trying to tell it in 280 characters. How do you include the nuances? How do you ensure that it's complete? Of course, there's an opportunity to put links, but how many people go ahead, to read the links? And sometimes when you read comments on a platform like Twitter, you're shocked as to what you posted and what comments you get. So how do we reduce the polarization with reducing the content? But that is a challenge for us as news leaders, to look inwards and see, okay, how do we reach and how do we begin to create content from the main news that gets the other people interested? So Nigeria is also in an election period, and we have elections from end of the year to next year. And something that is clear is that there is some interest in discussing about governance and about elections, but there's also a huge level of apathy. And the media is able to drive interest in civic participation. So how do we create content in such a way that we reach these platforms, TikTok and the rest, to actually reach this younger generation, to talk about history, to talk about all the things that inform civic participation, so that participation in governance can grow, and so that hopefully we get a better crop of leaders as a country and of course as a continent.
Thanks, Motunrayo. Chris, I want to bring you in here. You work a lot with newsrooms across the continent. What are the strategies that you've seen or that you've worked on where content is specialized for TikTok or Instagram for young audiences or for audiences in general? What has been done that you've seen in the newsrooms you work with?
Well, there's been a lot of examples in Kenya for one. In South Africa, so something like Times Live, I think, has about 350,000 TikTok followers, I think, last time I checked. And I think that the only way to make it work is to, and in fact, this was true of the early days of social media, before we had things like social media editors and influencers, used to produce those particular roles in your organization. And so I know that we're doing a lot of work training journalists across Africa on how to use TikTok. We've put together a how-to manual from a journalistic perspective. But I think if the kind of general comment I would like to make is perhaps leading on from what Khadija said, which is that because what she said was framed as being pessimistic, but it also had a bit of an optimistic touch to it as well, around the fact that these audiences do exist on those platforms. So I think the big question now for African media houses, for the few that we work with, is how do you monetize that? It's the same question, just with a slightly different platform and framework. It's sure we can reach news readers, sure somewhere like Times Live has a big audience now, but what's the point of it? Can we measure that we're building trust? Can we measure that we're gaining revenue? Can we have a conversion strategy so that our social media platforms, like TikTok, for example, can convert to membership or subscription? Those are the big questions at the moment.
Thanks, Allan. Sorry, Chris. Allan, I want to come to you because I know you have a hard stop at the top of the hour. In Nick's presentation, or at least in the report, we saw that YouTube has a huge usage, or for news rather, in Kenya. Could this be attributed to the affordable data costs? What do you think is, why is YouTube such a popular platform in Kenya compared to the other countries on the continent?
Thanks, Tshepo. Two things that come to mind. One is the digital migration that we did. And almost all the Kenyan channels are now on YouTube. They do live stream 24 hours a day. So that is one of the biggest contributors. So basically for us, you can access news anywhere you are through YouTube. You really don't have to have the physical set-up boxes to do that. So that becomes a big contributor. And number two, again, as I said, we've seen a lot of young people pushing through their channels, the YouTube channels. Because again, being dynamic, it becomes a revenue stream for the young creatives. And almost on a daily basis, right now you'll see a lot of channels being pushed either via other platforms, TikTok, Instagram. When you go to Instagram, you look at the reels, you'll see you're being redirected back to YouTube. So it's one of the things that the country just basically, the young people embracing that digital transformation. Thirdly, I think it's just the affordability in terms of the data, access to data and the cost of data. I think it's very low, which basically also helps in trying to push the stories out there. Then almost, when I looked at the report today, I realized that when you look at the Kenyan bit in terms of online consumption, you realize a lot of the sites listed are local, as opposed to the one from Nigeria where we see BBC topping. I see BBC at number 4 on the South African list. And when you look at all the local Kenyan channels, they also have YouTube channels that again, basically are uploaded and refreshed almost every minute. So the competition within the media here to capture the audience on the digital platform via YouTube is very intense. Even for us here at Nation Media Group, I think within our 6 brands, we are competing within ourselves just to push all those videos and short stories via YouTube. So because of that captive audience that is readily available for us. Yeah, thanks, Tshepo.
Thanks, Allan. I know we've reached the top of the hour, but I'm going to ask the panelists if you can stay on for another 5 minutes, just to get to some of the other questions that we haven't really gotten to. Before we close for today. And perhaps we can also continue the conversation on social media using the hashtag DNR22. Nick, Chris, Tolu, perhaps, Khadija, if you could touch on this. South Africa and Nigeria have a stronger reading culture than Kenya. This is from the survey. And with that, with increasing audiences preferring to watch the news, should online publications and print publications be worried? Khadija?
I'll have a quick go.
Oh, sure, Nick.
Sorry. Yeah, I think that over time, as sort of data charges get lower, increasingly media companies just need to think about different formats. We're obviously seeing that with podcasts as well. And currently, there's a lot more friction in the system in Africa and many African countries because of data charges than in other countries. But in parts of Asia where we see very low data charges, we're really starting to see that shift, I think. So it's not a sort of replacement. It's kind of basically an additional layer. And that, of course, at a time when you have fewer journalists, it's another pressure because you have to create journalism and then you have to package it in all these different ways. I think that's just part of the new reality that we're going to be facing.
I think we have Tolu.
I was going to ask Tolu if she wants to jump in. If not, I'll go. She appears to be shit.
Go for it, please.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I guess the short answer is yes, but. I wasn't. Nick, did the stats show, and Tshepo, did the stats show that Kenya had a less of a reading culture, or did it just show that they have a higher consumption of video culture?
Higher consumption, but also higher preference when it comes to online. So it's partly both, but that could be just conditioned by the supply side, as we've just heard from Allan, in terms of more video being out there, as well as it's hard to know what cause and effect is really.
Yeah, so I mean, I wouldn't use the word reading then. I mean, I would think consumption of news. I don't really care about the platform. I mean, it's up to us to use it. To use the fact they have an interest in the consumption. So yeah, I wouldn't see it as a red flag.
Cool. Thank you so much, Chris. One last question for the panelists before we call it a day. And it's tied to sort of paying for news. Nick, you mentioned that, or at least the report mentioned that subscriptions, or the number of people paying for news is quite low at still, I think 17%, if I remember correctly. And I was wondering whether the market has reached maturity, or are there still opportunities for growth across the various formats of reader revenue for news organizations, especially on the continent?
I mean, I think we don't have great data on it from Africa, to be honest, but I think, what we're seeing internationally is more publishers trying to get people to pay for news with subscriptions, and in richer countries, that's kind of working. I think in other countries, it's much more about, maybe donations or a range of different models. And it's interesting to see micropayments being used in Kenya. So I think the pattern will be different in Africa, actually.
Thanks, Nick. Ladies and gentlemen, I will bring this to a close. I'll just want the remaining panelists, if they could possibly indulge me in this sort of a final question on where to from now. We've got the results from the report. What are the lessons that we can take into the newsrooms for the remainder of the next 12 months until the next report? Motunrayo?
Well, I think that the report shows that we have work to do, and that editors, I always say that there is not enough time for self-reflection within amongst media leadership, especially the legacy media. We need to find time for self-reflection and see how do we not dilute, the ethics, the professionalism, but actually engage, because engagement of the audience will be key to converting them to people who participate and people who, if they had the means, would pay. So there's lots of work to do.
Tolu, your last word? What should we be doing?
So just to add to what Motunrayo had already said, so I think the use of online or social media to access news will continue to be on the rise. So also this misinformation and disinformation. So I think so this is more like a recommendation for newsrooms to adopt fact-checking techniques. So there will be a lot of fact-checking techniques to use when sort of debunk misinformation and disinformation. So, and I think this is where civil society organizations like Code for Africa can support newsrooms in Africa by providing capacity building for these organizations to acquire the skills needed to sort of debunk misinformation and disinformation. Yeah.
Thanks, Tolu. Nick, final words from you. Key takeaways that newsrooms can take in and take back to the newsrooms from the report.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a couple of things. So one is sort of just in terms of short term, how do we make the news more accessible, more easy to use? I think some of the data that comes out of this year's report is really compelling about that gap that we talked about before between the way the news is presented and what actually people want. So answering people's questions, more explanatory work. And then I think the second thing is, these things are much more difficult, is, you know, how you address some of these deep systemic problems around sustainability and of the media industry and the business models and the disinformation and polarization in society. And I don't think any individual media company can solve that on its own. I think that requires organizations that work across media companies. It requires media companies to work with governments and others to try and increase the perceived value of journalism and build it into, you know, digital literacy campaigns and all the rest of it. And it's a long-term project. So yeah, some difficult long-term things, but I think some practical things we can do in the short term.
Thank you so much. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. That's all we have for today. We've taken the tips from Nick and the other panelists today. And thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for making time to chat and listen and learning what key takeaways we can implement in our various newsrooms across the continent. Thank you to our panelists, Nick, Chris, Tolu, Khadija, Motunrayo, and Allan, for indulging us this morning/afternoon. Thank you to our colleagues for joining us. And please feel free to reach out, chat to us, Reuters Institute, Jamlab Africa, email us, chat to us on Twitter, social media, wherever you can find us. If you have any ideas on how we can collaborate, drive actual impact through our different platforms and other various channels, please do so on our various platforms, social media or email, or call us if you do have our numbers. And again, thank you once again for taking the time to join us. And we hope to see you at the next Reuters Institute Conversations or Jamlab Meetup. From myself, Tshepo, and the team, thank you so much and God bless.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Tshepo.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye.